and told me that's what children are for. And it wasn't until the foreclosure notice arrived that I understood just how deeply they'd used that sentiment. The number they'd quietly racked up, spread across half a dozen different lenders, hovered somewhere north of $750,000. It was a figure so staggering, so alien to the modest suburban existence I'd known, that for a solid week, I just stared at the official-looking envelopes, the red ink bleeding through the paper, like a stain on our family history. My dad, Frank, a man whose handshake was usually as firm as his pronouncements were absolute, had always cultivated an image of quiet success. He'd been a regional manager for some generic tech company, the kind that churned out beige boxes and promised a brighter future that never quite arrived. Mom, Carol, was the quintessential homemaker. Her days a blur of PTA meetings, perfectly ironed school uniforms, and potluck contributions that always won blue ribbons. They were the bedrock, the unshakable foundation of my world. Or so I thought. The first real tremor hit during Thanksgiving dinner, 2 years before the foreclosure. It was a slightly awkward affair, as it always was when my older brother, Mark, was in town. Mark was the golden child, the one who'd breezed through college on a partial scholarship, landed a high-paying finance job in Chicago, and now sported designer watches and a condescending smirk. He was the one who'd inherited Dad's business acumen, or so they kept telling me, implicitly framing my own less-than-stellar academic record in literature as some sort of failure. I was the artistic one, the dreamer, the one who worked a steady but unglamorous job at a local art gallery. My parents usually treated my career with a sort of polite, bewildered indifference, as if it were a quirky hobby I'd never quite grown out of. This particular Thanksgiving, however, the indifference had curdled into something sharper. We were sitting around the table, the scent of roast turkey and cranberry sauce thick in the air, the usual forced pleasantries floating between us. Dad was holding forth on the stock market, a topic I'd long since learned to tune out, when Mark casually dropped a bombshell. "Hey, Mom? Dad? I was looking at the paperwork for that vacation home we were talking about. The one down in Key West?" he said, his voice smooth and self-assured. "Looks like there's a significant mortgage on it already." I assumed that was just, a standard business loan or something? A beat of silence. Carol, who had been meticulously carving the turkey, paused, her knife hovering over a drumstick. Frank cleared his throat, a sound like gravel shifting. "Well, Mark," he began, his voice a little too loud, a little too casual. "That's complicated." Mark's eyebrows shot up. "Complicated? It's a mortgage, Dad. Unless you've been building a secret mansion for sharks. I'm assuming it's on the Key West." "Property?" Carol finally set the knife down, her hands trembling slightly. "It's not exactly a mortgage in the traditional sense, honey. It's more like a long-term investment. An investment that requires hundreds of thousands of dollars and is listed as a lien against a property you co-own?" Mark pressed, his tone shifting from playful to suspicious. He was sharp, that one, always had been. He could smell a rat from a mile away. Frank's face flushed. "We've been managing our finances responsibly, Mark. Don't you worry your pretty head about it." "My pretty head is the one that's going to be on the hook if this investment goes south," Mark retorted, the jovial tone completely gone. He pushed his plate away, his appetite clearly vanished. "Because I happen to remember that when I was applying for my first apartment lease out of college, you guys insisted on being guarantors. And when I wanted to buy my first car, guess who co-signed?" A knot began to form in my stomach. I remembered those conversations. My parents had always been eager to help with Mark's financial ventures, to the point of being almost insistent. They'd framed it as them being proud parents, wanting to give their successful son a leg up. But now, hearing Mark's pointed questions, a different picture started to emerge. a picture I didn't like one bit. "And my student loans, remember?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. I'd never ask them for much, just help with tuition, and they'd always provided it, albeit with sighs about the crippling cost of education. I'd taken out loans, of course, because even with their help, it wasn't enough. Carol's smile was tight, almost painful. "Of course, dear. We supported you every step of the way." "Did you?" I asked, the knot in my stomach tightening into a vice. "Because Mark's right. You were always there to co-sign, to guarantee, to help. But you never explained where all that money was coming from. You just did it." Frank slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware jump. "That's enough, Sarah. You don't understand these things. We made financial decisions to support our family. That's what parents do." "By taking out loans in my name?" The words tumbled out before I could stop them, fueled by a sudden, icy dread. The vague unease I'd felt for years, the feeling that something wasn't quite right, coalesced into a terrifying certainty. Another silence descended, heavier this time, suffocating. Carol stared at her plate, her face a mask of carefully constructed composure. Mark looked from his father to me, his eyes wide with dawning horror. "Wait, what did you just say?" Mark asked, his voice dangerously low. I looked at my father. His jaw was clenched, his gaze fixed on a point beyond my shoulder. You took out loans in my name, didn't you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "And maybe in Mark's too?" Frank finally met my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I saw no love, no warmth, only a chilling. "Children are an investment, Sarah," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They are meant to contribute, to help secure the family's future. We made prudent financial decisions. That's all." The world tilted. The comfortable, familiar dining room felt alien, hostile. My parents, the people who had raised me, nurtured me, and whom I had loved unconditionally, had done something so fundamentally wrong, so utterly betraying, that I couldn't even begin to process it. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the violation, the deception, the casual way they treated my credit, my future, as a disposable asset. Mark stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a scrape that echoed in the sudden quiet. You actually did that?" he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief and something akin to disgust. "You took out loans, using our names, without telling us?" Carol reached out a hand, as if to touch his arm, but he flinched away. "It was for the best. Mark," she said, her voice thin, "we wanted to secure your futures, and Sarah's." "My future?" I choked out, the words catching in my throat. "You've mortgaged my future, Mom. You've taken out hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans in my name, and you call that investing in my future?" I could feel tears stinging my eyes, hot and angry. I blinked them back fiercely. Crying wouldn't help. Not now. "We intended to pay them back," Frank said, his voice regaining a fraction of its old authority, though it was undercut by a desperate edge. This was a temporary measure, a way to bridge a gap. A gap that's now being used to foreclose on your own property? Mark's sarcasm was biting, cutting through the tense atmosphere. "That's not your concern, Mark," Frank said, his face darkening. "You have your own life, your own finances." "My own finances are perfectly fine, Dad, thanks to my own hard work and not being used as collateral for your shady dealings," Mark shot back. "But this is different. This is criminal." "It's family, Mark," Carol pleaded, her voice cracking. "We did what we thought was best." "No," I said, my voice gaining strength, a cold, hard edge I'd never known I possessed. "You didn't. You lied. You stole. You used me." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, mirroring Mark's earlier action. I looked at my parents, their faces a mixture of shock and something that looked like fear. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected me to understand or to react or to push back. They'd always seen me as the compliant one, the easy one. "I want to see the paperwork," I said, my voice steady now, a chilling calm settling over me. "All of it. Every single loan. Every single payment. And I want to know exactly how much you owe." Frank hesitated, his eyes darting towards Carol, who simply shook her head, almost imperceptibly. "That's not necessary, Sarah." "Oh, it's very necessary, Dad," I said, stepping away from the table. The air in the room felt thick, charged with unspoken accusations and a raw, simmering resentment. Because I have a feeling this is just the beginning. I walked out of the dining room, the sounds of my parents' hushed, frantic whispers fading behind me. The carefully constructed facade of our family life had crumbled, and in its place, a stark, ugly truth had emerged. They had taken out loans in my name, not to help me, not to invest in my future, but to what? To fund their lifestyle? To cover their debts? The foreclosure notice confirmed it. They had gambled with my life, and they were about to lose. And as I walked into the quiet living room, the untouched plates of food, a testament to the abrupt end of our Thanksgiving, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not going to end with me quietly accepting their explanations. This was going to end with them understanding the true cost of what they had done. The humiliation of that moment, of realizing I'd been a pawn in their financial game, was a cold, hard ember that began to glow within me. It was the first flicker of a flame that would soon consume everything. The next few months were a blur of hushed phone calls, frantic online searches, and the slow, agonizing piecing together of a financial nightmare. I'd confronted them again, armed with a printout of my credit report, the damning evidence of their clandestine borrowing spread out before them. Their initial reaction was a torrent of denial, then a pathetic attempt to spin it as a misunderstanding, a favor they were doing for me. But the numbers didn't lie. The dates, the amounts, the interest rates, they were all there, stark and undeniable. I saw loans taken out just before major family vacations, just before Mark's engagement party, just before they'd helped me with a down payment on my first car, a car I was now struggling to afford because of the ongoing debt. The emotional whiplash was brutal. One minute I was feeling a surge of indignant fury. The next I was drowning in a wave of sorrow and betrayal, the sheer magnitude of their deceit overwhelming me. I learned that they had consolidated some of the debt, taking out larger loans against their house. The house I grew up in. The house where I had my first scrape on the knee, my first kiss, my first real heartbreak. That house was now leveraged, a house of cards built on a foundation of my stolen credit. Carol cried a lot during those confrontations, her tears a desperate, manipulative attempt to regain control, to elicit sympathy. Frank, on the other hand, retreated into a stony silence, his face a mask of stoic resentment, as if I were the one inconveniencing him by uncovering his financial malfeasance. He would occasionally mutter about how ungrateful I was, how they had sacrificed everything for us. It was a perverse twist of reality, a narrative he was desperately trying to sell himself and anyone who would listen. Mark, thankfully, was on my side. He was furious, appalled by their actions, and immediately offered to help me navigate the legal aspects. He introduced me to a lawyer, a sharp woman named Miss Evans, who specialized in consumer protection and fraud. She patiently explained the concept of identity theft, even when it's perpetrated by family members, and the legal avenues available to me. The thought of suing my own parents was abhorrent, a prospect that filled me with a deep, aching sadness. But Miss Evans's calm, pragmatic approach, coupled with the sheer injustice of my situation, began to chip away at my resistance. "They used you as a financial escape hatch," Miss Evans had said, her gaze steady and direct. "They saw your credit score as an asset they could tap into without your consent. It's a clear violation, and unfortunately, it's not as uncommon as you might think." The revelation that my parents, the pillars of my community, the people I'd always seen as paragons of virtue, were capable of such deep-seated deception was a constant source of pain. It forced me to reevaluate every interaction, every financial decision they'd ever made for me. Was the college fund a lie? Were the small allowances they'd given me actually just repayments of loans taken out in my name? Every memory was now tainted with suspicion. The unconditional love I'd felt for them began to erode, replaced by a cold, hard anger. The turning point, the moment the humiliation began to solidify into a steely resolve, came during a family gathering at their house a few months after the initial confrontation. I'd been invited, and despite my reservations, I'd decided to go, partly to observe, partly to gauge their current state of denial. Mark was there too, his presence a silent testament to his solidarity. The atmosphere was tense, thick with unspoken accusations. My parents, however, seemed to be trying to project an air of normalcy, as if the financial storm brewing around them was just a minor inconvenience. Carol was bustling in the kitchen, her movements jerky and overeager, while Frank sat in his usual armchair, flipping through a magazine with an air of forced detachment. Mark and I sat on the sofa, a chasm of unspoken understanding between us. Then, my aunt, Carol's sister Brenda, a woman known for her bluntness and her penchant for gossip, arrived. "So," Brenda said, her voice booming as she entered the living room, "heard things are a little tight over here lately, Carol? Frank, you're not looking so chipper. Something going on with the market?" Carol flushed crimson. "Oh, Brenda, you know how these things are," she said, her voice unnaturally high. "Just a bit of financial planning, nothing to worry about." "Financial planning that's causing foreclosures, huh?" Brenda said, her eyes narrowing. "Heard from your cousin Betty that they're thinking of selling the house. Is that true?" Frank slammed his magazine down. "Brenda, this is family business. It's none of your concern." When a business involves public records and potential bankruptcy, it becomes everyone's concern, Frank, Brenda retorted. "And frankly, I'm appalled. Taking out loans in your own children's names? That's just low, even for you two." The word appalled hung in the air, a damning indictment. My parents' faces contorted with a mixture of shame and fury. Carol sputtered, trying to defend herself, but Brenda was relentless. "Honestly, Carol, I thought you were a better person than that. Sacrificing your own kids' futures for what? A bigger house? More fancy vacations?" Brenda's voice dripped with disdain. "And you, Frank, always so concerned with appearances. This is a new low, even for you." The humiliation was palpable. My parents, the proud, self-righteous couple who always lectured us on integrity and hard work, were being exposed, their carefully crafted image shattered by their own niece. Frank's face was a mask of pure rage, while Carol looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her. Whole. They were trapped, their attempts at maintaining control evaporating in the face of Brenda's unflinching criticism. As Brenda continued her tirade, I watched my parents. I saw the panic in their eyes, the dawning realization that their carefully constructed world was imploding, and that their own actions had brought it all crashing down. The initial shame I'd felt for them, the sorrow for the lost innocence of our family, began to recede, replaced by something colder, something more potent. It was the dawning of a new emotion, an emotion that felt powerful and strangely liberating. It was the quiet hum of emerging control. They had taken everything they could from me, manipulated my trust, and left me vulnerable. But in their desperation, in their avarice, they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated my resilience. And as Brenda's words echoed in the tense silence, I realized that the humiliation they had inflicted on me was merely the fertilizer for something much more formidable. The seeds of revenge had been sown, and they were about to bloom. The silence that followed Brenda's departure was deafening, broken only by the ragged breaths of my parents. They looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in their eyes. They finally understood that the child they had used and abused was no longer the innocent victim. She was something far more dangerous. The foundation of their control had cracked, and the tremors of my awakening were just beginning to be felt. The sheer, unadulterated mortification that hung in the air after Brenda left was a tangible thing. My parents, usually so adept at projecting an image of unshakable control, were exposed, raw and exposed, their carefully constructed reputations in tatters. Frank's face was a roadmap of fury, his jaw tight, his eyes burning holes in the Persian rug. Carol, on the other hand, was weeping silently, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. She looked like a child caught with her hand in the cookie jar, a child who'd been promised the world and had instead received a lecture on humility. But beneath the shame and the exposure, I saw something else starting to surface in them. A desperate scramble for damage control, a primal need to reassert their authority, to somehow rewind the tape and erase Brenda's accusatory pronouncements. They'd always relied on their perceived superiority, their financial stability, and their ability to frame any situation to their advantage. Now, that shield had been ripped away, and they were staring at the consequences. I watched them, not with pity, but with a growing sense of detached observation. The initial sting of their betrayal, the raw wound of their deception, had begun to cauterize, replaced by something colder, more strategic. Miss Evans had cautioned me about the emotional toll of pursuing legal action against family, about the potential for deep-seated resentment and broken relationships. But in that moment, sitting on their too-plush sofa, listening to Carol's muffled sobs and Frank's furious silence, I realized that those relationships had already been irrevocably broken. They hadn't just borrowed money, they had borrowed my trust, my future, my sense of security. And that was a debt that couldn't be repaid with apologies or tears. Mark, bless his practical, finance-minded heart, saw it too. He glanced at me, a silent question in his eyes, and I gave him a subtle nod. We were on the same page, united against a common enemy, even if that enemy were the faces of our parents. The tension in the room was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Frank finally broke the silence, his voice a low growl. "That woman is a menace," he spat, his eyes still fixed on the rug. "She always has been." Carol looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. "Frank, she's my sister. And she's right. We made a mistake." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it held a new, fragile truth. The weight of Brenda's words, coupled with the undeniable evidence of their financial ruin, was finally starting to break through their carefully constructed denial. Frank scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. "A mistake? That's putting it mildly, Carol. We're talking about our entire lives collapsing around us, and it's all because of this. He gestured vaguely, encompassing me, Mark, and the general air of impending doom. The implication hung in the air, a fresh insult. They were trying to shift the blame, to cast themselves as the victims of circumstances, and by extension, of their own children. It was a classic Frank maneuver. I felt a flicker of the old anger, the hot surge of indignation, but I forced it down. This was not the time for emotional outbursts. This was the time for precision. "No, Dad," I said, my voice calm and even, deliberately cutting through the rising tide of their self-pity. "It's not because of this. It's because of what you did, what you agreed to. You took out loans in my name, loans that are now jeopardizing your home and your entire financial future. And the money? Where did it go?" Frank's eyes snapped to mine, a flash of pure, unadulterated panic in their depths. Carol gasped, a hand flying to her chest. Mark leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on his father, waiting. "That's a private matter, Sarah," Frank said, his voice regaining some of its forced bluster. But it was too late. The fear was evident. He knew I was no longer just a source of borrowed funds. I was a potential threat, a loose end he couldn't control. "Private?" I countered, a hint of steel entering my voice. "My credit score isn't a private matter. My financial future isn't a private matter. And the money that you use to fund your lifestyle, to keep up appearances, to apparently maintain this house, that's also very much my business now, isn't it?" He opened his mouth to retort, but I pressed on, my words coming faster now, fueled by a growing realization. "I've been looking at the consolidation loans, the ones you took out against the house. The interest rates are astronomical, and the repayment schedules, they're aggressive. It's almost like you knew you were in deep, deep trouble, and you needed to leverage everything you possibly could to buy yourself some time." Carol whimpered. "We were trying to fix it, Sarah. We were trying to make it right." "By taking out more loans?" I asked, my voice rising. "Slightly? Loans that are now directly tied to the equity of the house? The house that you're now facing foreclosure on?" I felt a cold wave wash over me. It wasn't just that they'd borrowed money. It was the sheer recklessness, the desperate, almost pathological pursuit of their lifestyle at any cost. They weren't just bad with money. They were actively gambling with mine and with their own future in a way that felt calculated. Miss Evans had mentioned something about predatory lenders, about people who prey on desperation. And then it clicked. The sheer volume of loans, the rapid consolidation, the increasingly unfavorable terms, it wasn't just poor financial management. It was something far more insidious. "You know," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, a dangerous calm settling over me. "I've been digging into those consolidation loans, and the lenders, they're not exactly the usual suspects. Some of them have been flagged for questionable practices. They specialize in debt consolidation for people who are in distress, people who have nowhere else to turn." Frank's eyes widened, his carefully constructed composure shattering. Carol let out a small, strangled cry. Mark looked at me, his brow furrowed, a dawning understanding in his expression. "What are you saying, Sarah?" he asked, his voice laced with apprehension. "I'm saying," I continued, my gaze locked on my father, the man who had always been so proud of his business acumen, "that I think you didn't just borrow money. I think you were steered into these loans. I think you might have been taken advantage of, especially when you were at your most desperate." Frank's face went ashen. He'd always prided himself on being the sharp businessman, the one who could outsmart anyone. The idea that he had been outsmarted, that he had been duped into signing away his home and my credit on terms that were deliberately designed to trap him, was a blow he clearly couldn't comprehend. That's not true, he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. I understood the terms. I made informed decisions. Did you? I pressed, leaning forward. Or did you make desperate decisions? Because these lenders, they don't care about your retirement. They don't care about your family. They care about interest rates. They care about foreclosures. And they're very, very good at what they do. Especially when they have someone like me, with a pristine credit history, to offer as collateral. The scope of their deception, of their willingness to exploit me for their own gain, was sickening. But the added layer of them being potentially manipulated themselves, of them being the victims of their own desperate choices, was a bitter irony. It didn't excuse their actions, not by a long shot, but it explained the sheer recklessness, the sheer depth of the hole they had dug. I contacted Miss Evans about this new development, I said, my voice steady and deliberate. She's going to look into the lenders, see if there's a pattern, see if there's a way to challenge those loans. Carol finally broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. No, Sarah, please, don't do this. We'll lose everything. The house, everything. Frank stood up, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and fear. You can't do this. You can't turn against your own parents. You already turned against me, Dad, I said, my voice quiet but firm. The raw emotion of the moment was fading, replaced by a chilling clarity. You took my name, my credit, my future, and you treated it like a commodity. You put your own comfort and your own image above my well-being. And now you're facing the consequences of your choices, but you're not going to drag me down with you. He took a step towards me, his hand raised as if to grab my arm, but Mark was suddenly between us, a protective barrier. Don't, Dad, Mark said, his voice low and dangerous. She's right. You crossed a line. Frank recoiled, his face a mask of disbelief and wounded pride. He looked at Mark, then at me, his eyes darting between us, searching for any sign of the compliant children he'd always known. But he found none. He found only resolve. He found only consequences. This is your fault, Sarah, he snarled, his voice thick with venom. You always had to be difficult, always had to question everything. If you had just done as you were told, none of this would have happened. The absurdity of his statement was almost laughable. He had stolen from me, endangered my financial future, and he was blaming me for it. It was the ultimate act of gaslighting, a testament to his complete lack of self-awareness. No, Dad, I said, standing up, my voice resonating with a quiet power. This is your fault. Your greed, your desperation, and your underestimation of me. You thought I was just a name on a piece of paper, a pawn to be moved around your financial board. But you were wrong. I'm not a pawn anymore. I'm the player. The look on their faces was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a dawning horror. They had always seen me as the pliable one, the artistic dreamer who wouldn't understand the complexities of finance. They had underestimated my resilience, my intelligence, and my capacity for anger. They had pushed me to the brink, and in doing so, they had unleashed something they couldn't control. The carefully orchestrated facade of family normalcy had imploded, leaving behind a landscape of shattered trust and simmering rage. I turned. I'm going to need your help with the legal aspects, Mark. And Miss Evans will need all the documentation you can find. Every bank statement, every loan application, everything they've ever done with their finances. Mark nodded, his expression grim but determined. Consider it done. I'll start going through their files as soon as I can. As I walked towards the door, I glanced back at my parents. Carol was still crying, huddled in her armchair, a broken figure. Frank stood by the fireplace, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance, the picture of defeated pride. They had always operated under the illusion of control, of superiority, but now they were just two people drowning in the consequences of their own avarice and deceit. The humiliation they had inflicted on me had been a crucible, forging my pain into a cold, hard resolve. The power had shifted, irrevocably. I had been their credit card, their unwitting accomplice, but now I was their reckoning. And the true reckoning, I knew, was only just beginning. The weight of those loans, of their betrayal, was a heavy burden. But for the first time since receiving that foreclosure notice, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The future was uncertain, the legal battles ahead would be grueling, but I was no longer a victim. I was a fighter, and they had made sure of that. The silence that followed me out the door was not the silence of defeat, but the chilling quiet of a storm. Gathering strength, the echo of the closing door seemed to reverberate through the expansive, sterile silence of their meticulously maintained home, a silence that had once been a comforting backdrop to childhood memories, now heavy with accusation and the stench of impending ruin. I stood on the manicured lawn, the late afternoon sun a harsh spotlight on the opulent facade of the house that was no longer just my parents' symbol of success, but a monument to their deceit. The air, crisp and cold, sinking. Had they found something new? Something I had missed? The foreclosure notice on the house. It's official. They've been served. And there's a second notice from a different lender. Apparently the consolidation loans you uncovered, they were just the tip of the iceberg. There are multiple liens on the property. And Brenda's been sniffing around too, asking questions about the estate, about potential inheritances. She's been doing her own digging. A cold dread washed over me. Anxieties, to allow the weight of their actions to press down on them. The silence was a weapon, a stark contrast to the constant barrage of demands and expectations they had always subjected me to. It was a void they couldn't fill, a control they couldn't exert. I was no longer in their orbit. I was orbiting them, a distant, implacable force. Then Mark called. His voice was tight, strained. "Sarah, you need to see this. It's worse than we thought." "What is it?" I asked. Of wealth and status they had built on a bedrock of manipulation and deceit. Later that week, the calls started. First, a terse, almost belligerent voicemail from my father, demanding to know what I had done, his voice raspy with a fury that was clearly masking fear. Then, a tearful, pleading call from my mother, her voice choked with sobs, begging me to reconsider, to not ruin them. I let them ring. I didn't respond. Miss Evans had advised me to go silent, to let them stew in their own. Were so focused on hiding it from the taxman, from creditors, that they didn't think about hiding it from a daughter who was willing to follow every single lead, no matter how buried. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of motion and thought. I replayed Brenda's words, Miss Evans's measured legal advice, the sheer unadulterated panic on my father's face. It wasn't just about getting my money back. It was about dismantling the very foundation of their perceived invincibility, the edifice. That was a key. Miss Evans is cross-referencing everything, tracing the money. They were so careful, so sophisticated in their deception. They thought they were untouchable, but they forgot one thing. Mark raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "That money leaves a trail," I said, pulling out of the driveway, the house receding in the rearview mirror. Especially when it's moved around like that, across borders, through layers of questionable entities. A certainty that had solidified in the crucible of their betrayal. For years, I had been the quiet observer, the one who absorbed their pronouncements, their expectations, their casual dismissals. I had been the one they could always count on to be there, the dutiful daughter, the artistic dreamer who wouldn't complicate their carefully curated lives. But their actions had not just wounded me, they had awakened something dormant. Brenda mentioning the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, she said, starting the engine. The hum was a steady, reassuring beat. It looks like their assets being frozen. It looks like them having to face the reality of their financial destitution, not just for themselves, but for the first time, understanding the true cost of their actions. They gambled with my future, Mark. And when you gamble with someone else's future, you don't get to dictate the terms of the loss. A tremor ran through me, not of fear, but of a nascent power, a cold crystalline. And old books was a comforting anchor in the sea of turmoil. They thought they could leverage my trust, my credit. They thought I was their safety net, their emergency fund. They were wrong. I'm the safety deposit box they never knew existed, and I'm about to withdraw everything they deposited without my consent. Mark leaned against the car, his expression thoughtful. So what does that look like, Sarah? The withdrawal? It looks like them having to sell the house to cover the loans. Really? Against their own desperation. Miss Evans is building a case based on predatory lending practices, on the possibility of coercion given their financial state. But my leverage isn't just legal, it's personal. They still think they're playing by a set of rules they understand, rules of inheritance, of family obligation. They have no idea about the rules I've been learning. I slid into the driver's seat, the familiar leather cool against my skin. The scent of my car, a faint trace of coffee. Curtain. But Miss Evans is going to be the one to dismantle the stage. And I'm going to make sure every single prop that belongs to me is returned. He nodded, his eyes following mine. So, what's next? Miss Evans said she'd get the ball rolling on investigating the lenders, but what about the immediate fallout? The house? They're going to fight this tooth and nail. They can fight all they want, I said, unlocking my car door. The click was sharp, decisive. They're fighting against themselves. It was there, a flickering ember in the surrounding darkness. Define okay, I replied, my voice a dry rasp. I'm breathing, I'm not crying, I'm not screaming. So I guess that's a start. He gave a small, sad smile. That's more than I can say for them. I've never seen Dad break like that. Not completely. He wasn't broken, Mark, I corrected, my gaze drifting back to the imposing structure of the house. He was exposed. There's a difference. Brenda tore down clean, couldn't scrub away the grime of what had transpired inside. Brenda's departure had been a sonic boom, but my departure was a phantom limb ache, a gnawing emptiness that spoke of something irrevocably severed. Mark caught up to me as I reached my car, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored my own, though his was tinged with a protective concern that had always been his hallmark. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, hesitant. I met his gaze, searching for the familiar warmth,